Look at clumsy Gerald, the animals all sneered. Giraffes can't dance, you silly fool. Oh, Gerald, you're so weird.
Excuse me, talked the cricket.
Who'd seen Gerald earlier on?
But sometimes when you're different, you just need a different song.
They shouted, it's a miracle, we must be in a dream. Gerald's the best dancer that we've ever seen.
Hola, Filadelfia. ¿Cómo están? Hi, Philly.
All right. Hello, my name is All right. Hello, my name is Miguel Johnson. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a writer and a recent graduate of the NLGJA student program.
And I'm Jorge de Santiago. Pronouns are he, him. I'm with Telemundo, based out of Chicago. I want to welcome everybody to the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection. This being an LGBTQ conference, take that as you want. There's so much going on today.
Yes, there is. We hope that you've been having a great experience with all the excellent breakout sessions you've been having this morning. There's even more great programming to come this afternoon. So be sure to join us back here in Regency B for the Fireside Chats featuring a sit-down with NBC's Senior VP of Editorial, Janelle Rodriguez, followed by an award-winning country yeah, right.
Got this.
Followed by a sit-down with the award-winning country singer Cheryl Wright. Okay. In a chat that will be sure to cover everything from her
Career.
#1 single white female, to her coming out to her work as Chief Diversity Officer at Unipace.
Yep, there is so much going on today, so we want you guys to be on the lookout. Check SCHED, which is CHED, so you guys are making sure that what's going on with the different breakout sessions and stuff like that. There's a lot of awards to many good people that are gonna be coming up. And there's a lot of great journalism going out there. And I love that we're part of this community and that we're making a difference one story at a time. Feedback is always welcome, and it is extra helpful for our wonderful staff and convention planning committee. So make sure that you use that feature of the SCHED. Now that you guys are here, we're about to get started with the first plenary in just a few minutes. But before that, we're actually going to go to some awards to some great people.
Right. So the first award we have here is for excellence in food writing from my former Student Connect colleague and dear friend, H. Connolly, for their piece in Bon Appetit, I realized I was trans while making cheese. Thank you. The judges said it was beautifully written. This is a complex and nuanced, vulnerable story about transition and transformation. This metaphor just works, even for those unfamiliar with both cheesemaking and the issues of gender identity. So.
Perfect. And you just saw our president, Miguel, here. So you guys will be taking a picture with him. We do want to thank our sponsors because this is all part through our sponsors too. We want to thank Dot Meredith for sponsoring our View from the Top plenary. This session has become an annual tradition, and we're here and we'll hear from the very top leaders in our business. So in just a few minutes, but we're going to continue on with some of the awards that we do have here. The next award is for excellence in profile writing, and that goes to Francisco Vara Horta, who helped organize today's excellent IRE programming, for his piece that ran in Los Angeles Times. For the first gay mayor in the US didn't expect to be LGBTQ rights icon. Francisco, congratulations. All right. So while we continue to celebrate people, we actually want you guys to look at one of the screens because we're gonna There's a couple of attendees that weren't able to be here, and we just want to thank them for their service and their great contributions.
So, and finally, we would like to present one of NLGJ's top prizes, the Jean Cordova Award, an award that recognizes achievement of an LGBT woman for their current body of work or an individual in journalism or an opinion, named for the late Cordova, lesbian pioneer in LGBT media.
Perfect. And that award goes to Christina Carl, who helped to be the moderator for our plenary today. Cristina has done so much. You guys know her career. Cristina had an amazing career of first. In 2021, when the San Francisco Chronicle named her the first current sports editor, she became our first woman ever named to be led sports section for the major daily and the first transgender woman. So congratulations, very well deserved.
Well, I would have had prepared remarks, but Nick Bosa signed a big contract yesterday, so I was a little busy while flying cross country. I'm going to just recall a memory that I came out 20 years ago, and when I talked about coming out to my parents, my mom, the person who taught me how to make marinara from scratch, but also taught me how to break a horse because she's a badass, coming out to her, the thing that she said to me was the hardest thing I think I've ever had to hear. But she said, well, we'll see how it goes, but you're going to have to give up sports. I didn't, and my response in that moment was just like, I don't know that. I don't think I'm not going to stop until somebody tells me to stop. 20 years later, I've achieved more than I think I would have ever dreamed possible in that moment because, in the years since I was, invited into the BBWAA. I'm a Hall of Fame voter in baseball, which, when I started Baseball Prospectus, I never would have envisioned. Spent a 10-year career at ESPN doing some amazing work, working with tremendous people and leading the industry in sports. And then, this latest opportunity with the Chronicle has been probably the most fun I've literally ever had in a career that's basically been defined by fun because it's sports. So, the last 3 years have been amazing. The last 20 years have been amazing. And, did I know that I would be able to do all of that in sports? I didn't know. But because I was willing to try and wasn't going to give up just on the basis of who I was, I'm glad I stuck with it. What can I say? I'm also delighted, of course, because Jean Cordova really speaks to me as far as everything that she had written on the subject of gender and sexuality. Her voice was such a inspiration for so many of us for so long. But also coming from a person who, in terms of shared faith, was particularly important to me. Her wrestling with that was not unlike my own because, of course, when she was a nun and then walked away from that, I was somebody who studied priestly formation in graduate school. Being able to wrestle with all of that is something that I think all of us have had to deal with in life in terms of reconciling our sense of self, our aspirations in our careers, and, if you're a person of faith, how you put all of that together into something called you. Being able to do all of that, Jean Cordova was somebody who really spoke to so many of us, and so, in accepting this award, I really just want to think about her more than anything else because at the end of the day, I'm just a sports writer and I'm having a lot of fun in sports, but what she had to say was so meaningful and so important that, here we are years after she's gone to think about what she had to say and how she inspired so many of us to get to the point that we are today. So that's all I got to say. And you've left me without a script, so I'm just going to say, is this the point at which I should invite up the View from the Top panel? Because a bunch of really awesome people are here to talk about journalism, and they're come on up. Let's all take a seat. I do not need this thing. We should all have a conversation. The one thing that I'm going to ask everybody after we all get up here is we're going to run really quickly through. Everyone should introduce themselves, tell us about your outlet. You should read about their bios because, I don't want us to all share our life story. This is for your benefit. We got a lot of things to go into. It's a pivotal moment in LGBT history and as well as journalism, the practice of journalism and the coverage of LGBT subjects. And so I really just want to focus on all of the wisdom that everybody on this panel has to share and also make a lot of time for questions because I'm sure everybody here has a lot of things they want to say. So with that said, why don't we just start down and...
It was on. There we go. Thank you so much for introducing us. It's so wonderful to follow after you because what a wonderful pioneer to start off this panel with. So thank you, and also a view from the top. My name is Marcus Mabry. I am the senior vice president. I'm at CNN. I'm the senior vice president of digital editorial and programming at CNN. You may or may not know, but we are the largest English language digital outlet in the world. Most months we beat the BBC. We're always the biggest one in the U.S., beating my cherished colleagues from the New York Times and everyone else over here. But I was at Newsweek magazine for 2 decades, then the New York Times for 8 years, then Twitter, before it was X, and I've been here at CNN now for 6.5 years. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sharif Durhams. I'm a managing editor at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and recently a deputy managing editor at the Washington Post. And that was all after I worked for Marcus. So Marcus, thank you, because I worked for him at CNN. And of course, I was president of NLGJA up through last year. So glad to be back.
Great to be here. I'm Joe Ruffalo. I am the GM and SVP over The Hill and News Nation Digital as part of Nexstar. I started my career at CNN, spent many years at ABC News, AOL, and was most recently making ocean documentaries for National Geographic. So I have the strangest history up here probably than anyone.
Hi, everyone. I'm Monica Drake. I'm a deputy managing editor at the New York Times. My resume is solidly New York Times. I've been there for 25 years, but continuing the 6 degrees of separation, I did work with Marcus. I'm currently managing culture and careers and new initiatives at the Times.
Hi, my name is Joseph Darius Jafari. I'm kind of the new kid on the block. I am the founder and editor-in-chief of Lookout, which is a nonprofit investigative news outlet covering exclusively queer issues in Arizona.
My name is Jennifer Dale. I'm vice president of recruiting for Gray Television, but no matter what title I hold at Gray, I'm always going to identify as a passionate journalist. I'm over recruiting for Gray, so we own 113 markets, television stations in 113 markets, and I'm super excited to be here with you today.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Keaton Fox. I'm the VP of News for KTRK in Houston, the ABC-owned station. I have a long history in journalism as well, but sort of done a little bit of everything. I've been on air, off air, just about everything, so I'm happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Janelle Rodriguez. I'm Executive Vice President of Programming at NBC News. I oversee nightly news with Lester Holt, NBC News Now, and our network specials team. Prior to that, I spent 15 years at CNN.
I'm Paul Bascober, President of Reuters. I am not a journalist. I'm a man of numbers. So I've been in and out of a bunch of media companies, Gannett, Bloomberg, Dow Jones over the years. So.
I'm going to start off with, I think, go right at the heart of it, which is we're at a very difficult moment in terms of LGBTQ issues in this country. Coverage of those issues on both the national and local level has come in a lot of fire, understandably, both the nature of the coverage, the depth of the stories, issues of both sidesism, issues with bad actors. I guess my question is, I'm interested in everybody's perspective on how we're handling this as an industry and what you think about your outlet and how it's handling these stories and whether or not it needs to do a better job.
I think it's easiest to answer at the end. Yes, we need to do a better job, absolutely. We all do. I think the industry, that both sidism is really super dangerous, especially when you have tough issues like this. I remember Newsweek in its early career in the 60s, became famous for standing up for black people should be able to eat at Woolworths and go to the lunch counter. You'll be shocked if you go back and look at the New York Times op-eds from the same period, and the New York Times is saying, well, you know, private property owners have a right too, and they should serve who they want. Because the country was literally both siderism at that time. And it's appalling to us today, but that's the way it was then. Today, we find ourselves in a moment where, you know, we thought the pride flag was uncontroversial at this point. But this year, even the pride flag became controversial. So this morning, I put my daughter, who is a very proud trans girl of color, on the school bus this morning for her first year of high school. And it obviously is personal for so many of us. And for those for whom it's not personal, it should be, because it's about rights and freedoms. And it's been said many, many times by very many famous people that if any of us are not protected, all of us are not protected. As journalists, I think what we get to hew to in this incredibly difficult and divisive time in our country is what's right, the truth. And hammering back to that over and over again and going back to the facts, even when people are telling you, oh, I don't care about your facts. I have different facts. I have alternative facts. Keep going back to the facts. I think is our only refuge in many ways.
Yeah, I have to absolutely agree with you there. I think that one of the conversations that we have in local news quite a bit, especially in Houston, which happens to be in a very, very red state, is how do we tell the truth? And I'll borrow a phrase from Christiane Amanpour, who says this quite often. It's not about necessarily being neutral, it's about being truthful. And so I tell our journalists, hey, there are absolute rights and absolute wrongs here, right? When we go and we're going into a community where they're pulling books off the shelves because they may insinuate that there's a gay character. Not that there is a gay character, but they may insinuate that you guys are kidding, right? No, this is really happening. And so it's about being able to say, this is bananas on TV in a regular way, instead of saying, well, we're going to give 50% to people who say it's not bananas. We're going to give 50% to people who say it is bananas. It's bananas! And we really need to have journalists who are unafraid to say, this is just out of this world crazy, and then be able to fairly tell those stories. But it absolutely is not about 50% either side, because that's not what our job is all about. And it's time that we really find some truth and be able to tell that often.
I think one of the things that we're kind of missing here is the fact that, you know, so I started Lookout at the beginning of this year because at every single news outlet I ever worked at, you know, pitching a story to the editor-in-chief about queer issues, I was told consistently that it's not a big enough population to cover. It's not an important enough issue, right? And even I left the Arizona Republic recently to start Lookout specifically because of that issue, because the community was saying out loud to the Republic, to the Tucson Sentinel, to all these different outlets, you're covering us wrong. And we went out and we talked to the people and we said, what do you want from your news coverage? Where do you get where do you trust the news most? And it was not local news. It was national news, like the Times, Washington Post, but even that was weighing with, you know, how much they trusted them. And the real issue is, yes, we're covering it wrong, but we're also not listening to the people of what they want covered. And that needs to be addressed from the top down, and we need to actually ensure that reporters aren't just doing dailies, but listening thoroughly on their stories.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that theme of listening. I mean, I think, you know, it's a rare editor or reporter who looks at a story that they have done, even if it's entirely accurate, and says, wow, that was like the perfect piece of journalism, right? Like everyone looks back at their coverage and says, you know, hey, I wish we had thought of it this way, I wish we thought of it that way. And with the benefit of more information and more conversations, we're just better able to cover what is basically becoming the decisive issues of our time. I think one thing that, so in addition to listening to people and communities, I think we also need to listen to, you know, the editors and reporters on our staff, you know, who are challenging and asking us questions. We need to, you know, listen and have dialogue with people and organizations like this one here, because, you know, every day as our perspective is more informed by those conversations, the coverage can improve.
I think it also comes up to how we staff our newsrooms, you know, recruiter here. I mean, because one of my biggest frustrations as a news director, which was my job before I took this one, was making sure that my newsroom reflected the people that I was there to serve. And it's so easy if you're in an echo chamber of your newsroom where everyone has the same opinion to think that you are making the right choice when there's a whole other world out there. So I think we have to look at it from when we're hiring too. How are we reflecting the people that we're serving? And and I think that comes in so many different ways. It isn't, lots of times people fall back on like how the newsroom looks, but it's also the thought process. I feel like we need to be, like diversity is also social economic diversity, because many times, at least I felt in my newsroom, I sometimes felt like I was hiring people who could make a withdrawal from the bank of mom and dad, and that was one of my complaints and why I wanted to move into this role, is I feel like we need to reflect the people we serve on every level.
I would just jump in and say, NBC, I'm incredibly proud to work with Brooke and her team. We have a whole section on digital dedicated to LGBTQ issues called NBC Out, and I think it's incredibly important, to your point around diversity, having subject matter experts who understand their communities and what the biggest issues are, and then also to have regional reporters out there across the country who can also speak to why is this library becoming this lightning rod of contention, and trying to understand, right? There's, I think, a difference between both sidesism and also trying to illuminate and understand why is this becoming the red herring of this political season, right? Because the more we can understand, and I think the more journalism we do around those issues on all sides, which is different than the both sidesism, right? It helps people in the public dialogue understand what is it that we're contending with. Because if we just are shutting each other out, it's really hard to understand how do we even get at this point where we can, reconcile communities, right, and make people feel safe wherever they're coming from.
I would echo everything that's been said. I think our job is to be storytellers at the end of the day, and we need to make sure that we're doing that, excuse me, in the fairest and best way possible. Part of our mantra is trying to be nonpartisan and unbiased in these, but I think some of the biggest bias in media is story selection. And I think it's up to us, and especially as journalists, to make sure that we are telling these stories and reflecting them in the most accurate and fair way possible. And I think in some ways, a lot of these storylines are getting lost. We're focusing on maybe some of the bigger, more flashier types of things, but I think it's our job on a daily basis to make sure that we are bringing those up. And much, at the Hill, we have a reporter that is dedicated just towards this, and that's a major focus of hers, is to really look at these stories and make sure that we are delivering those stories in the fairest and best way possible.
Can I just push back on two things? One thing is, even though we are storytellers, we really are community builders. I mean, that is really kind of what we are, especially when it comes to queer issues. We are not just going out as people, a part of this community, reporting on this community. We are not just people trying to inform people of a nice story. We are trying to build community, and we're trying to align the entire community, which goes to my second kind of pushback, which is it's nice to have, diversity on staff, but that doesn't translate unless at the very top level there is an understanding of what happens. We have somebody at Gannett who is trying to cover housing issues, but is required to do it by clicks. I thought we were over this. And when you want to do queer issues, that requires nuance, that requires in-depth, and sometimes that's not a lot of clicks, but it's important for the community that is actually reading it. And finally, I just want to say that when you look at the stories that are being published at a lot of outlets, there's still a major reliance on white gay men. Where's the bisexual stories? Where's the asexual stories? Where's non-binary stories? We are missing a lot in this spectrum, and that is kind of what needs to be fixed through listing and more conversations like this.
So yes, I definitely want to affirm the idea that having people in the room and people in the room who are at the top and leading conversations is important. The kind of conversations that were had at CNN when Marcus Mabry is leading a meeting, or his predecessor, Mitra Kalita, was leading a meeting, was different than it was at other places I've worked. And it brought out different things in the staff than at some of the other places that I've worked. So it's important to have that leadership. I think we should acknowledge that media isn't a monolith, and that we do different things, and we do different things well. So there are advocacy journalists who do that work incredibly well, and they have the most credibility when they're doing that kind of journalism. Some of the places where we work, so for instance, I worked at the Washington Post, we could have editorials that were saying something about some of these issues. But actually the most credible work is when, for instance, we gathered in a room and said, can we do the most comprehensive poll of trans issues that has been done. Can we work with Kaiser Family Foundation to do that? And by doing that and then going out and telling stories that had more resonance with the audience that we have than other work that we've done. And so you have to look at a place like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution or CNN or the Washington Post and say, where are you going to have the most credibility? And do your best work in that space, and that actually will inform the conversation. And you know, I'm sure a lot of people in this room and on this panel will believe that when that information is accurate and told in nuanced ways, that it is actually beneficial.
I was just going to offer, you know, I'd like to think, first of all, many of our clients are in the room, so thank you for supporting us. You know, our business model is very much not reliant on clicks and traffic, and so we have the benefit of playing maybe a different role and having a different voice in the conversation. You know, for well over 100 years, our business has been about objective, getting as close to the truth as we possibly can on every story, being relentless in sourcing, being relentless in using data and thorough, just good, solid journalism to get to the root of a story. And, you know, our role in this conversation, I think, is to try and, you know, we write and produce over 5 million pieces a year, so we cover a lot of this subject. But I think our role is to sit there and to try and bring the facts and the data around all of these issues. So we can talk about gender-affirming care and the bills that are running through 37 states and 142 bills right now on pushing back on gender-affirming care. But we can also talk about the medical information and put that alongside of it. We can talk about the human rights elements, the parents' rights elements that go along with that to provide a complete narrative. Because our role is to try and sit in the middle, and that means that oftentimes our brand sits very politically center, which means we're often respected but not loved by everybody. But at the same time, we can do investigative work that talks about the lack of post-analysis and outcomes analysis around transitioning youth, and that the lack of scientific data out there on that subject. That's hard stuff to talk about. But I see our role as sitting in the middle and just trying to be brutal about making sure there are no vacuums for information and data that can be filled with political spin. So I just want to just say that there are roles, in addition to storytelling, building community, I think there's roles for people who just gather news, make sure that it's as accurate and close to the truth as we possibly can get it.
Yeah, but. Yeah, but. I'm sorry, with respect.
That's a great lawyer answer. Yes, but.
This is something that, particularly coverage of trans issues, particularly mainstream outlets' failures to do well in execution on stories on trans issues, has become a lightning rod. And for understandable reason. I have to admit, I'm one of the New York Times contributors who signed the letter. So when you, Monica, when you say that like you're listening to editors and journalists, the Times' kind of truculent response to their own contributors and editors saying, like, we think you have a systemic problem in the way in which you're covering this issue. And again, I mean, I'm sorry, but when you talk about parental rights, child abuse is not a parental right. So when you're talking about, like, you know, if you're going to create an equivalency on some of these things, that's dangerous, I would say, not just from, you know, the question of what that means for the audience, but how we're potentially misleading or misinforming people because we're elevating certain talking points that don't necessarily have the same, you know, actual value. You're ending up drawing equivalencies that are not equal. And so I think the question is, you know, in terms of the conversations we're having in our newsrooms, I think we have to get into, you know, what are we learning from the mistakes that are being made, are being published? I can tell you, you know, at the San Francisco Chronicle, we had a meeting where we sat down and talked about, like, how do we cover trans issues and how do we not cover them the way the Times covers them? Because we don't want to be that. And that's a very sad thing to you know, have as a reckoning in a newsroom, is that when you're seeing a, you know, understandably greatly respected institution in journalism not fulfilling the expectations that we as journalists or as readers might have of it. And I don't want to call out just the Times, because I think every newsroom at ESPN, we had that moment. And, you know, with the Dr. V story, we've seen every outlet make mistakes on this ground. The question is, what are we learning from those mistakes, and how are we improving, and what we're doing? And if anybody wants to weigh in on, like, how we learned from our mistakes and what we're doing to do better, that would be great.
I mean, I'm going to, I'll start since you mentioned the Times first. I'm going to set aside the response in the statement because I don't, you know, what I can provide is perspective on the way that we govern ourselves and the way that we make decisions about the news. You know, in the time since, you know, people from within the Times and beyond it have raised questions about our coverage, I would say that coverage leaders, not only the newsroom leadership, coverage leaders, you know, department heads, many people have, I mean, I would hesitate to put a number on it, but like countless hours, maybe a month's worth of conversations about how we are covering trans communities, the things that we want to change, the things that, you know, we think just through wording choices or other things got lost in translation. So we are literally, you know, internally processing everything that we hear. So that is the only way to change things. And I think that's the best way to do things with a bit of humility, with a bit of, you know, understanding that, you know, people's perception of the world is changing, and we need to actually stay abreast of that as we plan our coverage. It's not to say that we'll, like, you know, there are many issues that, you know, just that we cover, and there will be a piece once in a while that we just don't think is ideal, but that doesn't mean that it's not it's not something that we're working on. I guess I would say that. So when you talk about a truculent response, I will say that as journalists, we always want to tell the truth. We always want to tell the best story. Telling the best story is definitely not telling both sides of a story. We're not covering a debate. We're covering actual things that are happening to people in people's lives and people's rights. And that's our aspiration.
I think a big part of it goes back to something that you hit on, Christina, which was parental rights and these other phrases that have sort of permeated our vocabulary. A lot of those come from talking points, right? Think about who's creating these phrases and how they permeate into our society. Well, someone's coming up with them in a way that obviously sets somebody in a good light. Many times it's obviously political in some way. And then all of a sudden we pick them up in the media and spread them like wildfire, and they become permanent parts of the vocabulary that we use every day. And that's on us. That's our fault. Now, there is some degree where obviously people can go out on social media and do whatever they want to, and as long as we're not picking those up and repeating them, I think then we're okay. We obviously have to repeat them sometimes to say, it's this thing, which a lot of people call this, just to link the two. But I challenge our journalists to not take a phrase or some sort of ideology that has a label and repeat it over and over and over again. Because you think about like critical race theory. Does it mean anything to people? Like that was a political phrase that came up and got permeated through, again, the vocabulary. And it's on us as journalists to do a better job of picking apart these little phrases and making sure that we're applying them in the stories correctly and properly. Because they're always, you know, parental rights. Really? Like, again, I go back to this is the bananas. The one thing you're gonna remember from me of this is, that's the bananas guy. I say it a lot. I mean, it's 2023. Everything is bananas, right? But parental rights in the discussion we're having about trans rights and trans, it's a child outing is what it is. And that's what we should refer to it, or some sort of phrase like that. So I think it's up to us in the media to make sure that we're not continuing to repeat these phrases over and over.
I do think the temperature around so many of these issues, and this is just one tiny issue of so many issues, they're so heated in our conversation, in our politics, in our country today, which is, again, in a historically incredibly divisive point. You can't divorce it from history. Our America we're living in today is a different America from many, many different times in our history. I think the journalistic value we have, the power we have as journalists, is to cover when the school board meeting erupts. It's an amazing piece of sound, probably, and video and text story. Cover that. But also go back and say, well, who were those people who were at that meeting? Where did they get the roots from of what they were talking about and the phrases they were using? And where does the emotional valence of this power come from for them? And then, not on both sides, on all sides, who are all these people? These are human beings, right? How did they arrive to where they are? And then we can do the job. I will say, I think digital has this power over other forms of our journalism, of the explanatory piece of it. And we can take you out, and we can have links, and we can take a user way down to the rabbit hole of where a term comes from. Where does it connect with people individually as human beings? We can do all that, and we can do it over and over again, and we can do it in different stories in different places. And that's the power of our journalism, right? This explanatory power, and we have to, I think, lean into that more in 2023 than probably any other time in our profession.
I want to say that as journalists, we love navel-gazing. We're a big navel-gazing group, except when it comes to our history. We really don't kind of learn from our past. I mean, I'm thinking of like the 2016 election. It feels like we're kind of making the same mistakes over and over again. And when it comes to queer coverage, it feels like we're repeating the 90s AIDS coverage. Like, we are not giving it the same due diligence that we gave, other kind of like flash-in-the-pan conversations that happened maybe 5 years ago. We haven't been giving the same coverage of trans issues now, the same kind of post-mortem that we gave to the 2016 election. Maybe because we haven't reached that post-mortem moment yet, but I mean, it still deserves like a moment. When we started to look at what the pitch was for our funders, that for those of us who have covered or been around in news for more than a decade, you could probably know that criminal justice was the cops in court speak, right? This accountability aspects of the criminal justice system was lost on all major news outlets until a Marshall Project started. And, I think we need to kind of treat the criminal justice beat or treat the queer issues kind of the same way. Like, it needs to be treated with a bit more caution and empathy and reliability.
If I can respond to the comment on parental rights, I've clearly stepped in something here. I apologize for the clumsy words. It's interesting because my point on that was actually about parents' rights to take care of their kids when they've been denied the opportunity by a state legislature. So that it was really maybe a different view than it can be viewed. But I think your point is well taken, which is a phrase like that can be viewed in multiple different ways. I think, again, just to confirm, our role in this is to try and make sure that we're clarifying and framing the legal discussions that are out there, the rights of individuals, the rights of states, the rights of federal government, and just be as much fact-based and transparency on all sides of the issue. Not to be both-siderism, to say each should have its equal say in an issue. We do have core values and what we believe around free people, free speech, et cetera. But I do think that it's important that there is a source out there that tries to bring as much data and as much information, fill every vacuum so it can't be filled with propaganda.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that as much time as we spend talking about style guides, which is great as far as seeing their implementation, whether it's TJAs or NLGJAs or GLADs, we've got a lot of style guides we're throwing around. But we're operating, I think, in a very different space in terms of journalism today because we're dealing with coded language and the way in which people have kind of created terms like parental rights that end up getting freighted with values that far transcend what they mean on the page and what instead people end up inferring or inserting into what, who your audience is and who you're talking to. I remember a particularly infamous segment at ESPN, and I'm not trying to bash my former employer, but when they had a discussion about trans kids in schools, they had a gay man, Sid Ziegler, lovely person, lovely journalist, nice guy, all of that, speaking about like girls in sports, and you had a ADF lawyer speaking about girls in sports, and they did not mean the same things in the same ways, but they were using almost identical terms, and they ended up talking past each other, and because the host didn't have the cultural competency to really kind of tease out, well, what do you mean when you say that? So I'm kind of interested about like how we're dealing with that issue as far as like our audience, the people we're reporting on essentially talking past each other to talk to their audience, and to what extent we have a responsibility to actually get to the root issues and really kind of do the in-depth reporting that these subjects deserve.
I mean, I think some of that goes back to what we've all been alluding around the importance of hiring people across the spectrum of diversity and all of the things that that means, both regional, socioeconomic, racial diversity, religious diversity, big cities, small towns, sexual orientation. If you have that in a newsroom, then you can have these nuanced conversations. It doesn't matter what your own personal experience is, you're gonna have blind spots. There are gonna be communities that you're gonna have to report on that you don't have the nuance about, right? That you don't have the understanding about, that either you need to be able to phone a friend, call a colleague, and educate yourself, and that's on us before we ever go out in the field to make sure we understand a story, or as an editor, that you're assigning a correspondent that has the nuance and has the fluency, to your point, to be able to have those conversations and pick up on those things of like, wait, this person's using this term and this person's using that term. They mean completely opposite things here, and they need to have the fluency to be able to pick up on that. And I think that's just good journalism, no matter what you're reporting on.
I think some of this is also a challenge of technology at the time. We have all gotten very short attention spans at this point. So we're all kind of living by a headline, and we don't have a lot of depth in what's happening in journalism. And so I've heard people talk about clicks, and obviously there's a business reality to everything we're doing here. But I think that also lends a lot to this, as something's just a social headline or someone said one sentence, and that's pretty much all anyone's reading. And then as news people and journalists, we have to take that time to take that extra beat to make sure that we are going into more depth on these things as much as we can. I use the term things, but these issues as much as we can, because we have to fight some of this, which is just this quick turn, social headline, tweet, and then we're not getting to the depth of some of these stories, and it's allowing some of these, I think, storylines just to kind of continue and to continue to build in the marketplace. So I take that as a challenge, just as someone in this business, where we have to really think about how do we tell stories in different ways? How do we adapt to the technology and the times that we have to make sure that we are giving more depth and more energy to some of these topics?
One thing I'll mention is that when we bring diversity into our newsrooms, we have to value that diversity the same way that we value spelling things right, the same way that we value investigative reporting. I'm sure that everyone at some point in their career has dealt with an investigative reporter who is incredible at digging but couldn't write as well, right? So if we're bringing in, particularly if we're bringing in people at the beginning of their careers who bring diversity into our newsrooms, we may have to make up for some things that other reporters who are more experienced have, but it's worth making up for them because we're deficient in having that diversity inform the storytelling that we're doing. And so we need to make sure that that happens. And we have to also just make sure that when we're hearing criticism, particularly if it is coming from people who are other journalists, we need to listen to that. I mean, to give the New York Times credit, they did bring in NLGJ and TJA to have a conversation. And the key is to take out of that conversation that these are journalists who are wanting to help our coverage. That's what NLGJ is for, and has gone into newsrooms for decades, saying, here's how other journalists are thinking about this. Can we help you think about this in a certain way? And so being at a convention like this and hearing how other people are telling stories and giving feedback has always informed me in my career and what I tell people in newsrooms, and so I think it can be valuable.
Well, I feel like there's a lot more we could get into here, but I do want to leave some of that for audience questions, perhaps, and perhaps pivot to, you mentioned Sharif in passing, the diversity issue, but also I think, like we've just seen essentially kind of like a shrinkage of the entire market in the media in general across all, but particularly I think of the apocalyptic recent impact on LGBTQ journalism. So many outlets have collapsed, are no longer with us, and that's got to put a lot of LGBTQ journalists in, a pretty tight bind. A lot of people, I can say a lot of people in sports are looking for work, but I think, for LGBTQ journalists in particular, they're especially impacted by what we've seen as far as the contraction of the media marketplace. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering what everybody thinks as far as what is the future of LGBTQ journalism or the coverage of LGBTQ topics? Is it going to be mainstreamed? Is it only national? Is there a way to localize it, and how do local outlets end up, getting into how these issues impact their communities? How are we fostering the conversation, and what levels can we foster it, and how can we essentially enhance and grow LGBTQ journalism, or is it in a doom loop? Where are we?
One of the things I think is really important here is that not only have they been impacted by layoffs, but they're often pigeonholed into certain beats. So, I will never forget this when I was under Bill Keller at the Marshall Project, that he said when it came to hiring young people and people of color to cover prisons, it was really hard to find people who had the experience of an investigative reporter to join. Why? Because they are pigeonholed into arts and entertainment. They're pigeonholed into just specifically culture. And we're finding the same thing as we're hiring in Phoenix. We're finding the same exact thing. The people who are applying have never been given the opportunity, or they were given a fellowship during their college years to be on an investigative team. But instead, when they start applying for jobs, they are pigeonholed, and because they are queer, they are told to cover Pride. They are told to cover, the drag show. And so that is when we're talking about hiring and whether or not our news outlets are actually filled with the people they need to be filled with, we need to give younger people a shot. And I know that my old editors hated working with younger investigators because they didn't want to take the time to work with them, because it does take time. And as an accountability outlet, we're facing the same thing. But we have just hired a couple more people, and we literally have to take the time to teach them a different way of just arts and entertainment reporting on queer issues to accountability reporting on queer issues, and that takes time and resources.
I'm actually pretty passionate about that. I deal with a lot. I work with a lot of young journalists, and we have to get better about training and teaching, and we have to really be intentional, I think, with the people we pair our young journalists with, because they have such a different view. But when I talk to them, when I'm looking for someone, I'm looking for the person who wants to change the world. Well, we need to make sure we're pairing them with an investigative journalist or a more experienced journalist who wants to foster that. It kind of blows my mind. One of the most telling things anyone told me whenever I started hiring as a news director was, don't complain about the generation behind you, because you know what, you raised them. And I was like, I wasn't a parent at the time, but I'm like, you're right. I can, you tell people to prioritize this, and then we get frustrated when they're like, oh, family first, and we're frustrated when they're like, oh, I can't do that, I need to go to so-and-so. So I think, first of all, anyone who is concerned and looking for a job, come see me afterwards. Because before I came up, I was looking at our openings. But I mean, we've got to make sure it's a priority as a company, and speaking as a company that trains a lot of entry-level journalists, that we have the training resources available to make sure that they're prepared for the future.
Also, if I can, I agree with all of that, and I think, part of having a newsroom that represents the world that you cover also means thinking about diversity at all levels of a person's career tenure. We're really, there's a dearth of editors at many news organizations. We have a few programs to sort of support the development of editors who are making story decisions, so they're really key. But I just want to point that out. If we're talking about the future is not entirely Gen Z. And I guess the other question, though, that you had, was about the sort of shrinkage of just sort of the media market overall. I think it's shrinking, but it's also transforming. I think people are getting their news in a lot of different ways. The jobs and the journalism jobs and the economy of information is shifting. So, people are getting information on TikTok. Is that journalism? We should probably find out how to make it a space for more prominent journalism, considering the misinformation proliferating. And there's a promising growth in nonprofit newsrooms. I think it's like, there's some study I read recently, 17% growth or something like that over 2022. So it's changing and shifting, but I guess I'm a little bit more, a little glass half full on that front.
Yeah, definitely to speak to that. Well, first of all, we're hiring, so come see me. But you know, a lot of the people where the roles are shrinking now is because of a shrinkage of venture capital funded journalism. But that also was a tide that swept a lot of careers in that are in this room over the past decade, right? So that tide came in, that tide left, but it also taught mainstream organizations that there are a lot of talented journalists out there who are doing work for those places that mainstream organizations are now scooping up, right? So what we're trying to figure out is what the next tide is. Is it nonprofit journalism? Is it people starting up their own thing? Is it qualified and talented journalists going to TikTok, going to other platforms and trying to make a name there? All of that is being experimented with right now, and it is creating jobs. And the kind of question is going to be, is that sustainable as a business? As much as we're passionate about the work that we're doing, that work has to be backed by a business. And we have a business model that fell apart, 20, 25 years ago, that we're still trying to create in different ways. And people who are creative are doing that work, sometimes at the sacrifice of money that they could be making by doing other things. But we have to do that in order to figure out what the next solution is. We don't have it, sitting in our back pocket waiting to go.
And we believe in the power of local journalism. That's kind of how it's changing for us, is as our company grows and as we change, we're really leaning into local. I mean, I was news director in Charleston, South Carolina. You'll notice if you look at our jobs page that, what we're looking for are journalists who want to stay in the smaller towns. And as the world changes and as our business changes, we're really looking to expand the amount of offerings that we have in local journalism. So I think, would we have looked at this? Let's say when I first got into this business, we're like a 5 o'clock news, a 6 o'clock news. Now, the last time, most of our stations are starting 3 o'clock newscasts. So I think that's also the way the world has changed, is that we're going to be much more localized. I mean, that's exactly what you do, is local journalism in a digital format. So I think that is what kind of we think the key is.
We're also hiring at locally at Nexstar. I might as well throw in my own pitch here. But I take a much more optimistic view of this. I mean, I actually think it's a magnificent time to be a storyteller. I think it's a challenging business. There's no two ways around it. The industry is very much a challenge. But for the first time, literally everyone in the world is now a storyteller and telling their story constantly, maybe too much at times. But I think in such a time, there's huge disruption that is about to happen. It's already happening, as you've said. And especially for the younger people in this audience, I mean, the amount of transition and change you're going to see and that you're actually going to affect and build on is really awesome. And I mean, when I was starting at CNN Interactive way back in the day, when it was just being turned on, we didn't know what we were doing at all. I mean, it was like, oh my, you have 1 billion page views in like 2 years, and that was like as big as it got. But the amount of transition, how you can tell stories, how do you tell them in a shorter, more interesting way? How do you tell your own personal story, your community stories? If you have a real understanding of journalism and understanding and learning how to be a good storyteller, that's the most important thing, no matter what the situation in the world is. If you're really passionate about this, and you have to be passionate to do this for a living, as you all know, you have to get in there and learn the trade, and I think you can do that locally in a lot of other places. And then you also have to really appreciate and understand the technology around this. That is going to shift everything. It's already shifted, and the business. And if you can tell a story in a great way and you can understand the technology, you're going to be unstoppable, and you can probably unseat everyone that's sitting here in a couple of years.
And I'm going to add that there's not all TikTok is news, but there's definitely news on TikTok. There's a lot of news on TikTok, and it's really important for us, I think, for all of us to be there, certainly for us to be there. And I love what you said, because don't ever make the mistake, which we often make in news and politics and economics too, to assume that what's happening today is what's going to keep happening. It always changes. And so if you're in the right places now, if you're making a voice for yourself and a presence for yourself in digital platforms, I think the power's in your hands more than ever before.
Yeah, I want to take an optimistic note, I guess, to your question. I think there are a lot of opportunities, and there is no doubt we're going through massive disruption. But jumping on the point that you're making, if you're someone who wants to be a journalist or are currently a journalist, it really comes back to the fundamentals. Can you write? Do you have a technical skill? Are you a great videographer, cinematographer? Whatever part of the business you're trying to get into, the fundamentals of the craft are everything, right? And how that's going to express itself over the next 20 years, whether that's in streaming or local or a national news outlet, it always does coming back to the fundamentals. And for me, I look around the room, there's a whole number of people here from NBC, very gay, very out, very queer, very trans. And, you know, when we work together every day, whether they work at NBC Out or they're working, you know, they're working on a piece for Nightly News or for a streaming platform, we are just journalists, and we're very rarely talking about we bring our whole selves to work, and I'm very proud of that. But we get down to business, and we focus on the work. And I think if you are passionate and dedicated about the craft of journalism, whether, again, that's in front of the camera, behind the camera, you want to become an executive, or you want to work on the technical side of things, focus on the craft. There are opportunities, and just get at them.
I'm going to pivot again in terms of we've brought up changes, particularly in social media and the way we've used it. The other thing that social media has kind of created an outlet for, and I think creates a concern for all of us as journalists, has been about workplace safety. I mean, I think the death threats that sports reporters, of all people, get are coming through, you know, X or Twitter or Zitter or whatever we're calling it this week. But, you know, that's the way in which the increasing invective directed against journalists. What are the kind of conversations you're all having with your reporters, with your colleagues about safety and about whether or not people need to just leave a particular platform because there's just no value in their interactions, or it's impacting their lives and their ability to do their jobs because of, again, the level of hateful invective that's being directed at them?
Yeah, we've actually had that conversation about X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, and having real conversations about the value there. Because when we look at the amount of traffic that actually is generated from Twitter, I'm going to call it Twitter. I'm sorry, I can't do X. I just can't. I'm sorry. Zitter was pretty good. You want to call it Zitter? I'm into that. It wasn't worth it given the amount of hate that people were receiving. And it was garbage hate. It was like, wait, are people actually typing this? And you're like, okay, maybe they're not. Maybe these are they have to be bots, right? Because you can put anything on Zitter, and I'm adopting it. And someone is going to reply to you with something very garbagey, almost always. I can't imagine the types of things that you would see on that platform, because sports in general is bad.
Oh, no, it's the women in my department who, like, you know, whether Ann Killian, as a columnist, just writing about tennis, she'll get the most horrendous stuff that doesn't have anything to do with anything, but it's just about the fact that she's a woman working in sports. But then, you know, having a queer reporter on our staff and the kind of stuff that she has to put up with every story that she's writing about, like, you know, name, image, and likeness in college athletics. It's kind of crazy that, like, you know, the most innocuous topics end up being a way to transition into, I'm attacking you because you're queer, or I'm attacking you because you're a woman and with a job, go figure. So it's kind of moved beyond even the content. It's about being a vehicle for an attack, and the way in which social media has become essentially turned into this way of, like, invading people's lives and trying to hurt them.
We used to require a certain amount of tweets per day, and, like, you had to tweet at least once, and you had to have a Facebook post. We just got away from all of that because we realized there was really, while it's valuable to create a connection to the audience, one that's authentic, well, that's going to happen anyway. We don't have to force you to do that. So we told our reporters, listen, forget it. It's just not worth it to force you to be on a platform. We'll handle the rest. We actually have a company at ABC, which is wonderful and hiring and also very gay. And we're very gay. A wonderful group of people we had to hire a company to go and moderate comments for us because it's that bad. And so I think that just sort of speaks to the state of social media today.
I just wanted to add that, you know, we've had a similar internal reckoning, even not just tied to threats, which our reporters get quite frequently, but just actually for your own sort of health and productivity and your professional welfare, just like rethink your relationship with social media. Maybe it was when it was still called Twitter, we did put out a memo about, like, how to engage less. But one thing that we you know, of course, try to train people in safety. You know, don't take pictures near your home, like all of the stuff that you need to do to remain safe. And we're also, I think, having many more conversations, not just about physical safety, but sort of, you know, this can have an impact on your mental health. And so I think we're not just focusing on the tactical part of this equation, but really thinking about, how do we support journalists who, for whatever reason, because of their identity or the things that they cover, find themselves the targets of attacks.
If I could just plug one thing for news leaders who have, decision power in kind of the business side. This is unrelated to like the social media aspect, but related to safety. So we are ostensibly a red state, even though we have a blue governor and we have, we are progressing on purple, we are ostensibly a red state. And when we are trying to find people to work for us, one of the things that we are very cognizant of is the fact that we are asking people to move to a state that they are probably not going to feel safe in. And what we have done is that we have based just a simple thing, healthcare coverage. Our base healthcare coverage is a Cadillac plan. And that's completely covered by us because we understand that if we want to hire trans people, bottom surgery is not covered, right? Top surgery maybe is. HRT, maybe. At least like at a lot of different news organizations, their base medical benefits don't, you have to require your trans people or non-binary people to pay for this extra coverage. This is a simple thing that you can do to also benefit the ranks that you have in your newsroom, but also it just provides, better outcomes for your reporter's safety and mental health.
So I joined the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in, is this on? I joined the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in June, and one of the first questions I asked was, get me in contact with our safety team, let me know how I need to contact them when something like this comes up. And I think it's incumbent upon any leader in a news organization to, regardless of your level of resources, to know what your options are, whether they are using online tools, whether it is having a back channel with the investigator at the local law enforcement authority to know what kinds of things to report, what they can do to help, or whether you have a separate team that is doing that. You want to know that before it comes up, and you want to tell your staffers, particularly the young ones who feel, hey, I'm in my first job or second job and I feel insecure in this newsroom, you need to tell them up front that you want to know this stuff so that it isn't just coming to you when it's at a crisis moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm interested in everybody's perspective in terms of what are you doing as far as achieving full inclusion for LGBTQ coworkers and employees. I think your comment about trans care is one thing. Like if you're a woman in a workplace and if you're a lesbian and you're trying to have a kid, I mean, not every department, or some plans only allow if you've been trying for 12 months. Well, if it's, you're not even, before we'll allow artificial insemination, and if you're not even going to, allow for the fact that, lesbians aren't going to be trying for 12 months in that way before they can actually get to qualify for insemination. It just seems like benefits is such an important part of understanding that this is a huge part of your individual coworkers and teammates' lives, and you're not addressing it in the workplace in terms of what you're affording them because, well, it's equal for me, but it's not equal for everybody else. So being mindful of what everybody needs, I'm just kind of curious, like, have you had these kinds of conversations? Are you fostering this kind of opportunity? Are you worried about the person who works remotely in Texas or Arkansas or Alabama and is suddenly saying, like, I think I need to move, or I don't want to work here anymore?
Well, I'm going to say yes. Also, by the way, we're hiring too. Everyone else said that. Just point that out.
And you're also very gay.
True. I'm kind of literally had this conversation yesterday. Just thinking about, we have these systems and it's a big company and the bureaucracy is extremely complicated, but we, part of trying to work the virtual room is just making sure that we know how everyone is doing. We talk to their managers, et cetera. So just, we know that there is some flexibility in situations regarding benefits. Like just sort of have a team, detached team. It's like two people, sort of detached to figure out how can we make sure that someone gets her egg freezing benefits. If it's sort of a break glass in case of emergency situation. In terms of safety, though, part of what's interesting for us is that, we have a lot of domestic coverage, and in the past, we used to focus a lot of our security attention on overseas, but it's actually become much more something that we're just investing in, just safety of people who are reporting from around the country. We have, someone mentioned 2016. I mean, I think we want to make sure that everyone is firmly embedded and entrenched in communities that, may not be full of people, they went to college with or who even went to college. So doing that means that we have people who are going to be around people who are unlike them, who are intolerant of them, and definitely have those conversations routinely when we're talking about assignments.
I do want to throw it open to audience questions. I do want people to have a chance. And are there microphones enough to pass them around? Awesome. So I would start in front and then just move around the room.
My name's Jake Hilton. This question is for everyone except for Joseph Jafari. I am the executive director of Lookout Phoenix, so that's a conflict of interest. So one of the big things is we have a lot of big media news players, representatives in the room. We've been hearing a lot about LGBTQ coverage and how maybe it's activism. In that, is it the responsibility of these major players, of the news, of journalists, to cover identity-based violence, LGBTQ coverage, trans issues, anything like that? And if they don't, because of bureaucracy, image, whatever, are you complicit in the identity-based violence and or contributing really to the authoritarian playbook?
I don't think it's I don't think that
He is
covering.
not a journalist, by the way, so that's a very non-journalist question.
I don't think it's activism. To cover that identity-based violence is not activism. It's journalism, and so those things can overlap. But in this case, I don't think they do, and I don't think you can have a reputation as a news leader if you're not covering that. And I think one of the reasons we talk a lot about our industry being in trouble and the business models being in trouble, a lot of that is represented. I think a lot of us have been making DEI arguments based on the bottom line for decades. And we said, we need to cover our audiences because people are not going to pay to get the coverage if don't see themselves reflected in the coverage. And that might be one reason why we're losing audience, because we don't reflect enough of our audiences. So I think it's absolutely a core of journalism.
I have to agree. I just want to echo that same comment. And I think that a lot of what gets labeled activism by journalists is just journalism. That's what we're here to do. I think it also is really important on how it's covered, because I have seen a lot of really bad examples of coverage of identity-based journalism that actually fuels violence. And if we are not careful, even innocent people who are not trying to do that, but again, it goes back to what we discussed earlier about the use of phrasing, the types of people we're talking to and putting on the air. If we're giving equal time to people for these types of things, one person who might say, we should stand up and fight against this. Why would we put that soundbite on the air? We shouldn't. But we do. And so we have to be very careful about how we're covering those things, because we can actually do more harm than good.
I would just say that there's more than one kind of work that journalists do, and it is all journalism. So Mother Jones Magazine comes at journalism from a certain perspective, right? But their quality work is journalism. So you can either come at journalism from a certain perspective, you can be LGBTQ media, coming at journalism from a certain perspective that's going to dig deeper into certain issues than a mainstream news organization is going to do. Same thing with the black press, right? And we need that work. We also need the work of mainstream journalism to bring some of those stories. In fact, there's a fine tradition of mainstream journalists reading the work that is done by LGBTQ media and transforming it for mainstream audiences, right? The fact that CNN has the audience that it has means that it can do certain stories. I mean, I remember the criticism, and I'm sure I'm going to get it at AJC, where even people on staff will say, well, you're doing that really basic story about pride. Why are you doing this basic story about pride flags around the world? Well, people in Eastern European countries whose LGBTQ civil rights movement hasn't gone as far as ours actually react to that story and resonate with that story. And so I'm saying that there are different roles for different media players, and it's all journalism.
Yeah, just want to quickly say that, I think there's, covering violence overall is just a gutting experience to cover and edit and to process. There is something especially jarring, for identity-based violence. I agree with everyone here who said that it's just simply journalism. I think it was a month ago, someone in New York was killed. It was an anti-gay stabbing. It was literally 4 blocks from where I live. It's just upsetting to think about the idea that someone that you know could just be walking around and targeted in that way. So I think we're sort of duty bound to cover people who are marginalized and defenseless and whose stories escape notice. That's part of the mission of journalism.
Hi, Ina Fried with Axios and a longtime member, former vice president for print and new media. This is for Monica. I have enormous respect for the New York Times and all the journalism you do. One of the things that's always been a key for NLGJA is pursuing fair and accurate coverage. And, I have to say, the Times just has fallen short on that. One of the roles we've played as an organization, as individual journalists, is helping our fellow journalists do a better job of fair and accurate coverage. And I wonder what role you see for other journalists to be helpful in those discussions that you all are having, because what we're seeing consistently is, and it's obviously a very politicized issue around trans people, but too often our lives are being both sides. It's one thing if you're talking about a law and the politics around a law. Obviously, you're going to talk to people that are in favor or against. But increasingly and consistently, our lives are treated as up for debate. We are not at the center of the stories. Trans people are not. When it comes to reporting on the medicine, for example, at Axios, we have a policy. If we're talking about trans healthcare, we make sure prominently to say, trans gender-affirming care is recommended by all the major medical institutions. And so much of the coverage I see quotes people who are very anti-trans, who aren't experts in the science, put right next to doctors who work every day with trans people. How do we help the New York Times do a better job? Because it is, quite frankly, falling short. That's my opinion, not the organization. But it feels like everyone is trying so many ways to be helpful, and it feels it's not happening enough from within, it's not happening from without, and the consequences, it's life and death. And you guys are so important to journalism and to America, and it seems like there's a deliberate effort not to accept help. So I'm wondering, how can we help you do your jobs better as journalists, as folks who have expertise? Other folks in the industry are covering this well and better.
For that question. So I would like to just extend an invitation to have a conversation about our coverage. Like, that's literally what we've been doing, what we'll continue to do. It has resulted in some changes about our approach, some questions that we ask that we wouldn't have asked maybe 18 months ago. So I think you can help by having a constructive conversation with us. We're very open. I have a LinkedIn.
If I could just kind of piggyback to kind of support you. This isn't just a New York Times issue. This is almost every single legacy media news outlet, right? We have had conversations with the Arizona Republic, with the Tucson Sentinel about their really poor op-ed coverage of trans issues, and have been dismissed, right? So this isn't just a national newspaper issue. This boils down to what can you do as reporters, talk to your editors and get them to a point of understanding, because being real, the New York Times is gonna cover something if it's reported well and correct at the local news level, right? That's just kind of how the news filters up. And if it's left up to, just one news organization to fix everything, it's not going to happen, right?
I'll always support Monica, and I love the Times, but it is true that the Times has an outsized importance, right? It is as an institution, it is incredibly powerful, and other journalists take their lead from it. And I appreciate what the Times wrestling with, but you're right. We're all wrestling with it, right? All our organizations. We're all made up, organizations and institutions made up of people. And most of those people are of a certain generation where trans issues, if they were considered at all, were not at all considered in the way we consider them today. So that takes time. But I do think the graph that you always use, for instance, like we use at CNN always that graph of what professionals say about trans care. And we use that, in every story. We put in every story. So there are mechanical things that can help us until we progress in more of a way where all of us have more experience in talking about the issues in a more intelligent way.
Oh, thanks. So most of the folks on this panel started out as journalists. I mean, still, of course, I think once a journalist, always a journalist. But a number of you on the panel are now at the highest executive level, making management decisions, business decisions that affect dozens or hundreds of your colleagues. How have you prepared yourself to gain those skills, which some may overlap with the skills of a journalist, but there are clearly a lot of different skills. For the future leaders in the room, the middle managers in the room, what was that process like? How did you gain that information and those skills?
I'll really quickly say that, I was always a journalist, started often foreign correspondent, like Shelled in different foreign countries, but I was also a business journalist and a business editor, and I also went to Darden, University of Virginia Business School, and got a leadership executive education training there. And so I encourage everyone to get that business training. The reason actually I went to digital at the Times, when I moved from traditional journalism to digital, was because I knew that if we didn't find a business model for the extraordinary journalism of the New York Times, we wouldn't be able to keep making the extraordinary journalism of the New York Times. So at the core of all this is the business challenge.
I'll just say I didn't. I wasn't prepared for management whatsoever. I got no training. I got pushed. I was a little reporter doing my little Vines, oh, come on, you remember Vine, right?
Old.
Okay, I'm putting the mic down. I just aged myself there. But I got zero training. And so as now I'm the leader, I'm realizing that the people that I'm promoting into leadership have zero training. They don't know what they're doing. They've got to have some sort of a program to help them make the mistakes I made, but without making the mistakes I made, if that makes any sense. So we are at Disney trying to do these management courses that are at a very 30,000-foot level for sure. But at KTRK in Houston, where I'm leading, I'm doing sessions on a regular basis so that people are getting the experience of what happens when someone just says, yeah, I'm not going to do that. I had brain overload.
I didn't have a lot of training either until I was responsible for it. So one of the things I would say, and what I always tried to do with my mid-level managers was, okay, so they'll tell me, hey, I want to be a news director one day. I want to be an EP. Well, go ahead and start kind of giving them some responsibilities, allowing them to test that out before they're responsible for it. And then I also think as a company, it's pretty important that we have a track for training with that. Like, for example, in our company, we have two different ways in order to prepare you for that. One is a leadership training for future news directors, and the other is let's say it's younger journalists who we think could be the mid-level managers of tomorrow. But if that doesn't exist in your company, I would say just talk to your news director, because I saw it as my responsibility to look out my window and to be creating the person that will replace me whenever I moved on to my next job. I feel like I've been a success if I can do that.
Me first. Yeah, I would also sort of recommend training. I went through the Maynard Institute, which was sort of a bit of a life altering in terms of the way that I thought about management, because I think that I had this perception that you sort of made all of the decisions on your own. It's this very, you know, a leadership model that's perpetuated in American culture. But actually, if you start to learn that management is about embracing a team, surfacing the best ideas and using them to, you know, propel the work forward, like that is something that I've learned throughout my career, but it was in sharp focus through Maynard, partly because a lot of the emphasis was on communication. The only other thing I would say is, you know, probably do what you're doing now, which is, you know, interview leaders and people at media organizations, at your own, you know, use your skills as a journalist to sort of learn what's important. If anyone, you know, you can talk to your boss and say like, hey, if I want to ascend, like what are the things I need to work on? Not just what are the technical skills that I need to work on, but like what are the harder things to honestly, you know, get feedback on, like, you know, and always ask for that. I found that very valuable.
I was lucky enough to work at CNN for quite a time as I was ascending, where they did invest in me in terms of putting me through management programs. And the best one, I guess, they sent me to was a UCLA Executive MBA program. I think we've all worked for people who are really competent producers or reporters, and then they become managers and they suck and they're terrible and they have no people skills and they're totally disorganized, and right, it makes the newsroom a mess. They are really different jobs. When you go, at some point a boss had said to me, like, I'm not paying you to do anymore, I'm paying you to think and to lead, and so stop doing the jobs that got you into this job, right, and let go of that, and now start thinking more bigger picture and be a leader. And I think, you know, to emphasize the point someone else made, if you are a leader in the newsroom, you have to invest when you promote somebody. You cannot expect that they know. You know, it's one thing, I think a lot of people, I was talking to a senior producer the other day who was like, you know, I'm ready to be EP, I fill in. There's a big difference between I fill in every once in a while and now you are the complaint department. You are the one that has to deal with all the hot messes, and the higher you go, the less of your job is the fun editorial creation part, and the more of your job becomes dealing with other people's crises, other people's problems, and that type of thing. And I think we have to kind of support people as they ascend.
I'll mention, you know, there's visible training. Maynard, Pointer is amazing. Some of the executive MBA programs that people have mentioned. And then there is the invisible training that traditionally in newsrooms happens, but people don't tell you that they're putting you in that position. And that has served the people who have been leaders of organizations, right? That those people tend to get, oh, they're actually putting me in this position. And one thing that I've learned as a leader, and I think a lot of the people on this panel understand because of their experience coming up, is that you sometimes have to go to people and say, I'm putting you in this position to prepare you for X, Y, or Z. And if you don't say that, they don't get it. Mizell Stewart, who worked for Gannett and a number of other news organizations, talked about this gap in which people saw the potential, particularly in someone diverse in their newsroom, and are telling each other, like, boy, in 2 years that person is going to be amazing, and they never tell the person, and that person leaves before the 2 years are up. And so we as leaders need to be better at being more explicit, particularly for people who have not had those opportunities before.
Yeah, and I would agree with everything that's been said, but I think you also need to not be a unitasker. I think that's one of the most important things as you're young. Make sure you're getting a lot of different experience. You might be a great journalist, but learn the technology, learn about finance, follow the money in your company. If you ever wonder why a decision's actually being made, and you don't get this when you're junior, but you'll certainly get it as you get more senior in a company, follow where the dollars are, and that will help you with the logic of it. Also, don't be afraid of a bad manager. You can learn a lot. I learned a lot from people who I wouldn't say were great managers. It taught me a lot on how I should do that. And also, you're great communicators. That's what we all do for a living. But make sure you really understand that as you rise in an organization. You need to kind of set the tone for what the whole organization is. And I think a lot of us, I mean, I know I didn't have mentors that were gay in particular. You know, you have a lot of that now that we probably didn't have before, that you can talk to people to learn how I can do that. But don't be afraid to understand the people around you and be a communicator. I think the worst thing that most managers forget is that they have to communicate what they're trying to do. The best advice I heard when I was at Disney in a management group was, every meeting that someone has with you is their most important meeting that day. And once you really realize that as you get older in an organization, it changes your whole perspective. I need to be focused on this. I need to understand. I need to listen to them. But again, learn from everyone around you and try to experiment as much as you can.
With that, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I hope everybody on the panel is going to be more than ready to take questions one-on-one. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Before you get up, we have one more special guest to bring up for you that you'll want to sit down for. I wasn't talking to you. I was talking behind you. No, I'm kidding. Hi, everybody. I'm Ken Miguel, president of NLGJA. If you haven't heard that a million times already, I apologize. But I want to introduce our sponsor for this panel from Dotdash Meredith, Patrick Gonzalez from Entertainment Weekly.
Patrick Gomez, thank you so much. Yes, I am the editor-in-chief of Entertainment Weekly, which is a Dotdash Meredith brand. I want to thank this incredibly diverse in so many different ways panel here today. It's really interesting to hear them talk about a lot of what is necessary to have a diverse, but not just diverse, but also productive newsroom that's taking advantage of that diversity. And so I am very grateful to work at a company like Dotdash Meredith, where we have very, very active DEI groups and an anti-bias review board, so that we're not just relying on a style guide, that was, as was mentioned there, but that we are having people that we can go to and have actual conversations about how to correctly talk about very important issues, be it LGBTQ issues or issues of racial diversity. So I'll take this moment to say that we are also very gay in hiring, so come find us. And another thing that really struck me that I just want to close out this panel with is, be it that we are obviously first and foremost fact tellers and truth tellers, and maybe we consider ourselves storytellers, or maybe we consider telling those facts to be the most important part of it, and we also have the business side of it to think about. All of that is done by being creative. And there's a saying that creativity takes courage, and we're all, particularly journalists right now, being asked to be very courageous, particularly if you're an LGBTQ journalist. And so I am grateful that these panelists here today gave us some of the tools necessary to find that courage in ourselves, but also knowing that we can look to each other for that. And so I hope that you continue to find ways to have those conversations throughout this entire conference. We at Dotdash Meredith hope you come find us at our booth tomorrow. Like I said, we are hiring and very gay, and everything is really bananas there. I think I wrapped everything back up together. Thank you.
All right. So we're just about to be done. So if you guys are looking for a job, everyone here is hiring. So take that opportunity to say hi to them. And if you guys want to continue to grow within, just reach out to them. See what's the next step for your career. This is a good opportunity. They're going to stand right on the side, and they'll be taking some questions or anything like that. By the way, before you guys leave, we want to take one quick picture with everybody here, if that's okay. And we want to remind you there is coffee available, right? If you guys need a picker-upper and stuff like that. But thank you very much for being here today.
And I think we'd also like to remind you that there's another event happening at 5:30 here in Regency B at 5:30. So